Let's go into details about HTTP headers. Again, the 4 parts of HTTP are start line, headers, blank line, and body. Headers is bolded because that's what we're going to be talking about here. It's very interesting. Let's get started. Let's go into more detail about header lines. Here's our Google search page that we're all familiar with. Let's type in HTTP headers. And we can go to Wikipedia and find the list of header lines that we can use. Sorted by request, here are the header lines that we can use. And response, here are the header lines that we can use for response. So let's take a look at some of them. Accept language. This header line tells us the language we can accept in the response. For example, if it says accept language DE in the header line, that means we're saying to the program, only send us back information in DE. I'm assuming that means Deutsch or German. Authorization. This is an important one. If the API is security enabled and you need a token or an API key or a username and password, you specify it in the authorization header line. Cache control is another interesting one. What is cache? Let's take a look at the Google homepage. If cache is enabled, then this image here, this Google image, is in your cache. It doesn't need to be returned by the program. It's already in your system. If you say don't use cache, then it gets a fresh version of that image. Content type. We can specify the content type that we're sending to the program. Examples are data in JSON format, we'll learn about JSON later, data in XML format, which we'll learn about later, images, and other examples. Date, the date we're sending the request to the API. Host, this is an important one. For example, if we're doing www.google.com/search $Q equals tuna, which is the URL when we're searching for tuna, then we would put www.google.com in the host header line. What about some examples of response header lines? Here's our cache again, but in this case, it's done using response. So it will send us back a response with the type of caching that it's doing if we didn't tell it not to cache. In this example, there's cache control where the maximum age of the cache is 3,600 seconds. So after that, the cache expires. Date, this is the date that the response is sent. Expires is an interesting one. Say there is no max age in the cache control. Expires. What is expires? It means that the date that the response was sent plus the expires, say the expires is 1 day, so the date plus 1 day, the cache expires. It goes back and gets a fresh version. So here it says considered stale. Once it's considered stale, it gets a new version. So for example, it would get a new version of this Google image if the expires was 1 day. So 1 day later, after we clicked on this, it gets a new version from the API. Set cookie. Well, here's where it sends you back cookies. So if it sends you back 3 cookies, there will be 3 header lines starting with set cookie. Server. Remember, we go to a computer somewhere. We don't know where the computer is, what the name of it is. We can't know what the name of it is. In this server header line, it comes back with the name of the server. Exercise time. Relax, have some fun, take a break, turn on some music, learn about HTTP header lines when you're ready. For example, I can go to the Google homepage and, like I did before, type in HTTP headers and explore HTTP header lines. Let's talk about the HTTP blank line. Again, there are 4 parts to HTTP. There is the start line, then there are header lines, then there is the blank line, then there is a body. So what's the point of the blank line? Without the blank line, you wouldn't be able to tell where the header lines finish and where the body begins. Let's talk about the HTTP body. Again, there are 4 parts to HTTP. There is the start line, there are header lines, a blank line, and then the body. So what is the body? The body is what contains content. It could be an image, it could be an HTML web page, it could be a video, or it could be data. It just contains the content that you want to send to the API if you're doing a request, or the content that comes from the API if the HTTP is a response. What type of content can we include in the body when sending to an API using the request HTTP? And what type of content can we get back from the API when it sends a response HTTP? Well, guess what? There is a header line called content type. So that's the type of content being sent to the API, or the type of content being sent back from the API. So let's take a look. Here's our Google homepage. Let's type in HTTP headers and go to the list of header fields in Wikipedia. So if we go to request fields, we see content type. And if we go to response fields, we see content type as well. It's the same header line. So let's take a look at the various types of content that we can send. Here's a list. They sorted out by type and then slash and then subtype. So this would be the type. This would be the subtype. In this case, the type is here and it has various subtypes. The type is here. It has 2 subtypes. You get the idea. The most important thing is obviously the subtype, which describes the content. So you can see that you could send over images, or you could send over a flat file, or you could send a web page or get a web page. All of these you can send or get in the body of an HTTP request or HTTP response. But you have to put this in the header line when you're using the body, so it knows what to get, or your computer or cell phone or whatever knows what it is receiving. I would like to highlight 2 particular ones, JSON and XML. These are typical ways to send data to the API or get data back from the API. For example, if we are using the HTTP post method to create a user email account, we need to send over our username and our password, right? How are you going to do that? We have to send the API data. So we can send the API data in the format of JSON or the format of XML. So let's get into that now, JSON and XML. Exercise time. What is in the HTTP body? Content is in the HTTP body. Either content sent to the API if it's an HTTP request, or content sent from the API if it's an HTTP response. Next question. What header line describes the type of content in the HTTP body? The answer comes from the question. It's content dash type. So pretty obvious, right? Next question. What content types can you have in the HTTP body? Many. You could have data, you can have an image, you can have a web page, HTML, you could have audio, you could have video, you could have a flat file, many things. You could either send it to the API or get it from the API. Next question. What content types can be used for sending or receiving data? That is, sending data to the API or receiving data from the API. What I mean by data is text information. There are two. There is XML and there is JSON. This is used all the time in APIs because all the time in APIs we're sending data and we're receiving data. Sometimes we'll send images or receive images or web pages and things like that, but very often we're sending data to the API or receiving data from the API. So it's very important that you learn XML and JSON, which is why now we're going to get into the details of XML and JSON. Example of stateless. Let's go back to the late 80s and early 90s. They had these phones. Somebody would call, and when they called, the phone would ring, and you had no idea who it was and what they wanted. You pick up the phone, you say hello. Let's talk about HTTP in more detail. Stateless. What's meant by stateless? There's two words in there, state and less. The first word is state. State is the current situation in context. For example, if your doctor asks you what your state is, you're probably going to talk about your health, what's physically wrong with you. If your boss from work asks you what your state is, you're going to probably talk about work. The fact that you love working with these coworkers or that team, or you don't want to work with that team, or you want to learn this. If your friend asks you what your state is, you're probably going to talk about how you feel. You're going to say you feel great or you don't feel great, or you're relaxing, you're taking it easy. Depends on the context. If you tell your doctor or your boss that you're relaxing and you're taking it easy, they'll probably look at you like you're crazy unless you know them really well, right? So in the state of HTTP, you're making a web request and expecting a response. Less means without. Stateless in HTTP means that you're without something. What are you without? You're without the request. When I say you, I mean the application. The application doesn't know the request being made before it comes in. For example, the Google application doesn't know if the request is for search results or for a Gmail account or whatever else is that Google does. HTTP is stateless by default. Two ways of doing HTTP are REST and SOAP. That is, both REST and SOAP use the HTTP protocol, the start line, the headers, the blank line, and the body. REST and SOAP are stateless by default because they use HTTP, and HTTP is stateless by default. REST stands for Representational State Transfer. This means that all the request information